Hello, my name is Sherman Haywood Cox the second of soulpreaching.com. I want to thank you for coming to look at this video. In this video, we're going to answer the simple question, how to preach a sermon. We just got finished doing a video on how to write a sermon where we looked at some of the major processes that you should keep in mind when you are going to write a sermon. Here we're going to actually talk about preaching that sermon and some things to keep in mind when you are preaching a sermon, and how can you be sure that you're going to preach an effective sermon. The first thing that I definitely want to emphasize is a solid sermon plan. We talked about that in a previous video, but if you're going to preach an effective sermon, you must have a solid sermon plan to make sure that that your sermon is a part of a larger sermon preaching ministry that addresses the real needs of your particular congregation. Secondly, solid sermon exegesis. Sorry, I said sermon, but really this is Bible exegesis or Bible interpretation. You need a solid understanding of the text if you're going to preach that particular text. And then finally, solid sermon construction. I assume you put together an effective sermon, that it is put together very solidly. It is a valuable sermon. It is a needed sermon. These are some prerequisites that you need if you're going to preach an effective sermon. If you don't have these, then I don't care what you do in the preaching moment, it is not going to be as helpful as it could be. Now, I want to go and give some principles for preaching in the preaching moment. I often talk about two fundamental rules. I call it for sermon style, but two fundamental rules which are going to help us in preaching. And that is, number one, that our preaching should be consistent with the sermon. So you should preach in such a way that is consistent with the sermon. This really helps us, for if we have a sermon that is more somber, then our presentation of that should be somber. If we have an upbeat and happy presentation, then our presentation of that sermon should be upbeat and happy. It should be consistent with the sermon, as well as our preaching should be consistent with our self. In other words, we should preach in a way that is true to our inmost self. We shouldn't put on airs when we get into the pulpit or preach differently than how we are. So these are two fundamental rules that are going to help us whatever we do, however we present. If you've got some butterflies, allow the butterflies, use the butterflies. Don't just attempt to act as though you are something that you are not. One thing that is very difficult for people is when they see a preacher get up there who is obviously using a different voice than they normally have. They may do something. I don't know. You've seen them. They get into the pulpit and suddenly they sound like Martin Luther King. When you talk to them, normally they sound different. When you get in the pulpit, you ought to be consistent with yourselves, as well as your presentation should be consistent with the sermon. A couple of other things that are going to be helpful with you when you preach. Number one, know your sermon. Know it well. Go over it many times, and so that it has become a part of you. Know your sermon, and what's going to help that is to practice your sermon. Practice your sermon. Go over your sermon. Go over your sermon audibly. Preach it. That is going to help you to know it, not just in your head or with your eyes, but also the rest of your body is going to become a part of the presentation. Practice your sermon. That's going to help you to know your sermon. And then you're going to be well on the way to preaching an effective sermon. Another thing is to recognize the people. Recognize the people. By that, I mean allow space for the people. Allow the people to interact with you. When you see something on their faces of puzzlement, use that to actually go back over what it seems like they are puzzled or not understanding. Allow a give and take between the congregation and you as the preacher. Don't just preach in a monologue fashion. Look and allow the people to, even if they don't talk back audibly, they are talking back with their mannerisms, with other aspects. Recognize the people in your presentation. Another thing, I talked about using your butterflies, but forge ahead. One thing that many preachers will tell you that there is a little bit, they actually have a few, an apprehension or a fear or something of the pulpit before they get in there. Many preachers have that, even very seasoned preachers. So what do? You just go ahead and forge ahead. Oftentimes in the preaching is when you lose that particular fear that is going to stand in the way of you presenting your message. The fear that you have when you're sitting there before getting into the pulpit is not going to be there once you get started in many cases. So I would encourage you to forge ahead. Know your sermon, practice your sermon, allow space for the congregation to respond, and just go head on and forge ahead. If this has been helpful to you, I encourage you to come to soulpreaching.com to find other resources just like this one. God bless you and keep on preaching.